Hello, I'm Eun-jung Cho at the VOA News Center. North Korea is stepping up its saber-rattling in recent months, conducting a nuclear test and firing numerous missiles. And the international community is responding to North Korea with the strongest sets of sanctions. Today, we invite two Korea experts and find out what's behind North Korea's provocations, will the sanctions work, and what are the ways to go forward. We are joined by Mr. Frank Januzzi, president of the Mansfield Foundation, and Mr. Bruce Klinner, senior fellow at the Heritized Foundation. Welcome to both of you.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Mr. Klinner, let me begin with you. The United Nations and the United States came up with the strongest sets of sanctions on North Korea. Will these sanctions be effective in changing North Korean behavior? Would it be able to stop North Korea from further developing nuclear weapons or missiles?
Right. Well, the sanctions are not a magic solution, just as diplomacy wasn't. I mean, North Korea signed 4 agreements to never pursue nuclear weapons and then 4 agreements to give up the weapons they promised never to have. And certainly South Korea has tried engagement. They've had 240 agreements with North Korea. So right now we're trying sanctions. And sanctions are U.S. law. They serve a number of purposes: to enforce U.S. law, to impose a pain on those that violate U.S. law, to put in place measures to make it more difficult for North Korea to get items for their prohibited programs, and also to constrain proliferation. And then sanctions in conjunction with offers of diplomacy and other instruments of national power, trying to get them to live up to their denuclearization commitments as well as UN resolutions. But there's not a lot of optimism now that we can deter North Korea from continuing to augment its arsenal.
Mm-hmm. So in what ways can sanctions kind of put a brake to North Korea's nuclear development?
Well, targeted financial measures, which are part of sanctions, they go after the finances of the leadership. They don't impact the people themselves. It's trying to go after the regime and the leadership and all of those that are in violation of UN resolutions and U.S. law. So because the vast majority of North Korea's financial transactions globally are denominated in dollars, that means they go through U.S. banks, which are regulated by the United States government. So even though we don't trade with North Korea, their money goes through our banks, and that gives us tremendous leverage to go after those that are in violation.
Mm-hmm. I see. And Mr. Januzzi, you've long advocated dialogue with North Korea. What are your thoughts on sanctions? Will it be effective in changing North Korean behavior?
Well, I think dialogue and sanctions are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. And as Bruce said, the sanctions can play a role, but we need to clearly define what the purpose of sanctions are. 18 years ago, the Rumsfeld Commission wrote that within 5 years, North Korea could develop an ICBM capability once they made the decision to do so. I think it's undeniable that sanctions have slowed down North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. It's made it much more difficult for them to acquire the advanced technologies they need to advance their nuclear and ballistic missile weapons program. And so the turtle's pace of North Korea's nuclear program is partly the result of international efforts to constrain them. But will sanctions force the leadership of North Korea to change course, to rethink the wisdom of pursuing nuclear weapons? I doubt it. I don't think we can ever bring enough economic pressure to bear on North Korea to persuade them that this program that is so important to the legitimacy and the prestige and the power of the government should be abandoned. And that's why I think that if sanctions are to be used, they must be combined with outreach and diplomacy. And the goal of that diplomacy should be to convince them that there's a better way, a better path forward for them, and to use a combination of sanctions and incentives to try to persuade them of the wisdom of that new course. Bruce is right. So far, this hasn't worked, but I don't think we should give up.
Why do you think the economic sanctions will not put too much economic burden on North Korea? Is that because of China?
The short answer is China, yes. It's a little bit like a balloon. When we squeeze in one area, it expands someplace else. When South Korea chooses to cut off the Kaesong industrial complex and shut down that pathway of economic engagement, in the short term, it imposes a cost on North Korea, financial pain. But in the long term, it basically just increases their economic dependence upon Beijing. And so far, Beijing has not been willing to cut off normal economic exchange with North Korea. And I think that they would never agree with the sort of crippling sanctions that would really call the ability of North Korea to survive into question. I think sanctions can be part of a package of diplomatic efforts, but by themselves, I think Bruce and I would agree that sanctions alone are not going to be sufficient to convince North Korea to change course.
Right, but China at this time agreed to a very strong UN sanctions. Do you think China will fully implement the sanctions this time?
Well, they did agree, but even then a few days later they asked that 4 Chinese ships be taken off the sanctioned list so that they can maintain their economic trading relationship with North Korea. I count me as a skeptic that China will either fully implement the sanctions or would ever agree to even tougher sanctions of the sort that we might like to see in an ideal world to try to really impose pain on the North Korean leadership.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Glynn, what are your thoughts? Will China fully implement the UN sanctions this time?
They should. We're encouraged that they finally agreed to a more stringent UN resolution than they agreed to in the past. And we've seen a number of actions by Chinese banks and businesses. Now, to join Frank in skepticism, we saw virtually the same actions after each of the previous nuclear tests by North Korea. China will enforce them for 1 to 3 months and then will back off. But the important thing about targeted financial measures is that it impacts those businesses and those banks. If we look back at 2005 in the Banco Delta Asia example, 24 entities stopped doing business with North Korea, including the Bank of China, even though the government of China didn't want the Bank of China to stop doing business with them. But the Bank of China and others knew that if they were in violation of U.S. law, they too could face seizure and very large fines. We imposed a $9 billion fine on a French bank for money laundering. And they can also be precluded from accessing the U.S. financial system, which is the kiss of death for a bank or other financial institution. So these Chinese banks and businesses may be acting now even outside of the Chinese government's direction because they know otherwise they can be sanctioned by the United States.
Mm-hmm. And looking at the impact of the sanctions, what will be some of the areas that North Korea will feel most hurtful?
It'll be the leadership and those that are seen as in violation of the UN resolutions or the law. Again, sanctions aren't hurting the people. They aren't limiting trade. They aren't going after the livelihoods of people. But instead it's going after the finances of those that are in violation. So it's supposed to be targeted only against those that are in violation.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Januzzi, after the UN sanctions and unilateral sanctions by South Korea, Japan, and the United States, North Korea, undeterred, fired even more missiles. Why is North Korea acting this way?
Well, I think it's not surprising to me that in the face of international pressure, their immediate response, especially with a young leader who wants to demonstrate his toughness and his resilience in the face of foreign pressure, that their immediate response would be acts of defiance. And I frankly think we're going to see more. There may be additional missile tests, there may be additional nuclear tests, because Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, the last thing he wants to do is to demonstrate that this foreign pressure can force him to capitulate. And so he will do whatever is necessary, and he will continue, I think, to demonstrate his defiance. What worries me a little bit is that you do have a reasonably young, reasonably untested leader in North Korea. And I think there's a great possibility for miscalculation, misunderstanding. And the situation has become much more dangerous over the last few years in North Korea than it was at a time when North and South were routinely talking, working together at Kaesong and on other projects, and where the U.S. also had more diplomatic channels open to North Korea. One of the downsides of isolating North Korea is that we also have less ability to monitor what's really going on, what they're really thinking, what they're really calculating about their future. So I think we are at a dangerous time on the peninsula.
Yeah, I'd agree with Frank, but also point out that sometimes we overanalyze things, and it's not always about us. Every year, North Korea does a winter training cycle, a large-scale military exercise. the media focuses on the U.S. and South Korean exercises, but every year from December until April, North Korea engages in very large-scale exercises. And so all the photos we've seen of Kim Jong-un watching an amphibious operation, a new artillery system firing, that's part of their military exercises. So artillery rounds, short-range missile firing, I think is actually probably more part of this ongoing military exercise rather than necessarily a signal to the U.S. or the UN or South Korea. The longer range missiles, I think, straddle the military competency exercises and also a signal. But sometimes we tend to think everything is about us.
Right, right. So what are your thoughts about the possibility of the fifth nuclear test anytime soon?
Oh, it's going to happen. It's like saying, will it rain? Of course. It's in the nature of the system. It's just we don't know when. But I think Kim Jong-un is really telegraphing that there will be more nuclear tests and more long-range missile tests, I think, in the near future. He almost seems frustrated that the experts don't believe his capabilities. He's demonstrated 4 nuclear weapons tests. He's done long-range tests. He's put 2 satellites in orbit, which is the same as an ICBM warhead technology. Then it's almost as if someone is saying, well, sir, they still don't believe you've miniaturized a warhead. So it's, well, let me get a picture in front of the warhead.
Photo op.
And then, well, now they don't believe you have a reentry vehicle capability. Well, let me get my picture in front of this test to prove that our warheads can survive reentry. Well, sir, they still think it's several more years. So I think it's almost, he'll be like, look, we're going to do a reentry vehicle test just to prove that I have what I claim to have.
I think Bruce makes a good point. It's not always about us. Even the nuclear program itself, in part, is driven by their perception of strategic vulnerability, their desire to have a trump card to use. Shouldn't say trump card anymore, I guess, but to have a card to play against the United States. But it's also about the legitimacy and the power and the prestige of the North Korean government for their own people. So the Korean Worker Party is going to have an extraordinary Congress coming up in May. If there is a fifth nuclear test, it may be in part to drive home their displeasure at UN sanctions, but it may also be part of the celebration. Look at all that I have accomplished as the leader of North Korea as we prepare to hold this extraordinary Congress of the Korean Worker Party. And I think Bruce also makes a good point about the fact that the North Koreans are eager to be accepted as a nuclear power. When I visited North Korea in 2004 and had a chance to visit Yongbyon, at the end of our tour, the North Koreans said, well, now we have shown you our nuclear deterrence. And we said, well, no, you haven't. You've shown us that you might have the ability to produce plutonium. But a nuclear deterrence requires missiles and delivery systems and reentry vehicles. And I could see that they were frustrated, that they had not yet persuaded us that they truly had developed a nuclear deterrent capability.
Right, about that being accepted as the nuclear power, the upcoming new administration, U.S. administration, set to take office next year, how should they deal with North Korea? Should they go for just settle for non-proliferation or still push for the complete denuclearization of North Korea? Mr.
Look, I think the long-term goal clearly has to remain complete denuclearization. That's what we need for the credibility of the global non-proliferation regime. It's what the United States wants and needs for our security interests in Northeast Asia. But most important, it's what our South Korean allies require to live in security on the Korean Peninsula. But in terms of how we get there, it's going to have to be in phases. We're not going to negotiate the complete elimination of their nuclear weapons capability overnight. So I think that's where there must be some flexibility on the part of the international community in trying step by step to rein in North Korea's nuclear ambitions. I'm always a little bit worried when I hear U.S. officials say that North Korea's nuclear weapons are unacceptable. What does that mean, unacceptable? We're living with it right now. It's not our desired end state, but to say that it's unacceptable is to imply that, well, there must be something we're going to do right away to get rid of it. And unfortunately, I don't see any silver bullet that's going to solve this problem in the short term. So I'm not advocating that we should accept them as a nuclear power, but we darn well better get used to managing this problem because it's probably going to be with us for quite a while.
Mr. Kleiner, your advice to the new U.S. administration?
Well, what we're asking of North Korea is simply live up to your many commitments to never have nuclear weapons or to denuclearize yourself. That's all we're asking for, to live up to what they've already promised us so many times before. You know, when folks advocate re-engaging with them or discussing with them to slow down the problem before we solve it, you know, we tried to do that many times, and North Korea repeatedly shows that it is not willing to do that. The Obama administration came in offering an open hand of dialogue. North Korea very quickly showed they would act just as badly to President Obama as to President Bush. That caused a belated epiphany by many experts that North Korea is to blame for the North Korean problem, not the United States or South Korea. So the next president will be in a very different place than we were in 2009. Now, very few are pushing for unconditional engagement. No one's pushing for unconditional engagement. Few are pushing really for engagement. We feel we've been burned so many times by through many administrations. So, we hope sanctions will enforce our law and constrain their program. We hope in conjunction with offers of engagement, it'll get them to live up to their commitments. But we also have to make sure we have sufficient defenses for ourselves and our allies in the meantime. And that's deploying THAAD in South Korea, that's having a very strong alliance, not only with the Republic of Korea, but with Japan, improving trilateral coordination on the military side, as well as sufficient missile defense in the United States.
Well, I'm afraid this is all the time we have for today. Mr. Kleiner, thank you for joining us. Mr. Januzzi, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
From VOA News, this was a panel discussion on the effectiveness of international sanctions on North Korea and future options for the U.S. government.